Thank you very much for inviting me to moderate the panel. It's a great privilege, a great honor. Just a few words about myself before we start so that you know where I hail from. I'm originally from Kazakhstan, was born and raised there. Then I studied in Moscow, Russia. My wife is from Moscow. My parents since then moved from Kazakhstan to Russia, to Siberia, although my sister is still in Kazakhstan. She's actually married to a Ukrainian guy. My cousin lives in outside Kiev in Belaya Tserkov. So sometimes I have to moderate discussions. We try to stay out of politics for the most part, but it doesn't always work. I am a marketing professor here at Kelley School of Business. I teach international marketing in particular. I guess that's why I was called and invited to moderate the panel. But again, enough about myself. So we're here to listen to the panelists. And so it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. And of course, Mark does not need any introductions because we were very fortunate to hear the keynote address. Then we have also in alphabetical order Oleg Gostomelsky, and he is the vice president of the Hoosier Gasket Corporation. And so then Dennis Kelley, who is the president of Pacific World Trade. And so I also have some questions submitted by Vicky. But prior to going to the questions, what I wanted to do is just to let the panelists speak a little bit about their personal experiences in Russia, in Ukraine. And so this will give the audience a better understanding. And of course, I'm not sure about how much Mark might want to do it because he already talked about some. But again, we'll definitely let him do that. And I think we'll start with Oleg. And again, if you're having problems hearing me, let me know. Signals are all good so far? Okay, great. So we'll start with Oleg.
Thank you, Sasha. Basically, I've been involved with Russia and Ukraine in some capacity since about 1993. In 1993, I was still an Army officer, having graduated from West Point in 1990. And at that time, the Soviet Union, of course, came apart on Christmas Day in 91. In early 1993, the newly formed Ukrainian General Staff sent representatives from Ukraine, from their military, to the United States in order to facilitate relationships between the two militaries. And I was assigned as a translator. Was fortunate enough to be assigned as a translator to the visiting group. So I escorted the Ukrainian General Staff officers from Washington to Fort Drum, New York, where they visited the base and so forth. That was my very first experience, if you would call it that, with interaction with this part of the world. Thereafter, about 4 years later, in 97, after I've left the military, I was fortunate enough to be put in charge of a project where I worked for a different company at the time. We supplied equipment to manufacture food, all kinds of food. In this particular case, baby food. And we signed a contract with a company called Bubalar in Uzbekistan. So we were supposed to do a turnkey operation on 3 baby food factories, two in Tashkent and one in Samarkand. And I was in charge of it. Honestly, the only reason I was put in charge of it is because I spoke Russian. And so did every Uzbeki manager and technical person, because none of them spoke English very well, and we couldn't find anybody who could speak Uzbekistan. Back then, we did not know the United States Department of Commerce nearly as well as I do now, so I didn't know who to call. So now I do know who to call. But then we did this project. It was about a year-long project, and that was my second experience with the former Soviet Union. For the past 9 years, I've been essentially working. A big part of my job has been to grow the business in Europe, focusing on the emerging markets of the former Soviet Union. So I've opened an office, a sales office in St. Petersburg, Russia. I have also opened a distribution center / warehouse and hired a salesperson who is based out of Kharkiv, Ukraine. So we have, through these 2 avenues and registering companies in Russia and Ukraine, again, a lot of experience dealing with the business people in those 2 countries, and fortunately, sometimes with some wonderful assistance from the Department of Commerce. I've been fortunate enough to gain a lot of knowledge firsthand in working with the businesses in that part of the world. And it's been a challenge, it's been interesting, and ultimately I believe it is successful, and it's worth it, in my opinion, because the payoff definitely is, at the end of the day, significant enough to warrant the efforts required to achieve it. Dennis?
Okay. Thank you very much. I had some advantage early in my scholastic or academic career to have studied in Karl Marx University in Budapest, 1970, and some graduate work in former Soviet Union, in Soviet Union in 1973. So I had some academic background and understanding of Russia when I began to work there in 2001. My business partner, Nochar Corporation here in Indianapolis, has a technology to solidify radioactive liquids, and my job with Nochar was to take that technology on a global basis. So I went to Russia in 2001 with the assistance of U.S. Commerce Department through a Gold Key program, which was absolutely invaluable. I never would have been able to enter the market without Commerce's assistance. The Gold Key took me to St. Petersburg, where some of my Russian partners were based, some of the real experts in the nuclear industry. So we began our efforts there, did a lot of work with the Clopen Radium Institute for several years. And then in 2006, Senator Lugar asked me to determine whether or not we could take our technology and work with the U.S. Department of Energy in some of their non-proliferation programs. To the basic premise for the GIP programs is to keep Russian weapon scientists at their nuclear locations. They don't want scientists to be leaving Russia and the former Soviet states and finding pathways to Iran and North Korea and other countries. So it took me 2 years. I partnered up with Argonne National Lab in Chicago, who is my partner today. We've worked together for 8 years. We started a 3-year program in Russia at 3 nuclear weapon sites, 2 in Siberia, 1 near Krasnoyarsk and the other near Tomsk. And our base location was just outside of St. Petersburg. So we worked for 3 years. I worked with 60 nuclear weapon scientists to apply our technology to help them solve their waste problems, legacy waste from the Cold War. That program was very successful. We still have ongoing relationships with those sites. I was also able to reach an agreement with a distributor, Radon, based in Moscow, which is the premier radioactive waste treatment company in Russia. So they are our distributor today. As a result of the work on that 3-year project, which ended in 2011, U.S. Department of Energy asked me to participate in the second non-proliferation program in Kazakhstan at a location on the Caspian Sea, a nuclear site that produced about 10 metric tons of weapons-grade plutonium. Very severe problems at that site. We just completed that 2-year program last year, which has resulted in some new technologies that we developed with the scientists, and we have just applied for a U.S. patent through Argonne to bring that technology into the U.S. as well. And then next month, I'll begin a 3rd non-proliferation program in Armenia with two partners. So we've been active in that area, and we've learned quite a bit about how to do business, particularly in Russia.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Mark, do you want to add anything? You already talked about your experiences. But
well, I would. I already, as you said, I did sort of describe what I've been doing for the past 40 years or so with Russia and former Soviet Union. Really, to add to that, I would only say that in my experience, and Danica made that point, I'd like to stress it, it's very, very important that Russia is very much state-dominated, whether it's the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union or whatever we have today. And I think that for doing any kind of business in Russia, it's extremely important to have the needed contacts within the government structures of Russia, because without them, nothing will ever happen. And here the U.S. government can help, but sometimes U.S. government could be a hindrance. There were times when I went to meetings and they said, we'll have a meeting, we don't want anyone from the State Department, we don't want anyone from the government because for various reasons. So you have to, if you're in the business of setting up contacts, you judge when the U.S. government can be very important and absolutely indispensable for opening a door, and where it's better not to have them. But one way or another, you have to deal with the Russian government, the Russian state, because the state dominates everything. And I've had Russian friends who sarcastically say that there really is no private property in Russia. There is the private use of property so long as you behave and the state allows you to do it. So the notion of private property as something sacrosanct is very, very tenuous in Russia.
Thank you very much. This actually leads us very nicely into the first question. And the first question is specifically on Russia. The second question will be specifically on Ukraine. The third question would be applicable to both countries. But the first question is, what do you see as the key success factors in particular for small and medium-sized companies for doing business in Russia, especially given the economic sanctions imposed by a number of Western governments? And anybody wants to go first?
I'll start. I work for Hoosier Gasket, and Hoosier Gasket is in fact a medium-sized company. So we do not have the resources available to us internally that a giant like Eli Lilly or Cummins Corporation, or to name a couple of Indiana companies, would have available in their disposal. One of the success factors to me has been, first of all, close cooperation with, at least at the start, with the U.S. Department of Commerce. As Mark pointed out, the state is omnipresent in Russia. Because of that, there is a certain distance that exists, correct me if you disagree with this, but a certain distance exists with the senior officials in Russian government and a typical Russian person. In my experience, at least, that has been true. That is obviously not the same as is the case in the United States. We are far more democratic. Most of our public servants are readily accessible. However, that is not perceived that way in Russia. So what the U.S. government can do, by virtue of its embassy, is open doors to you which would not otherwise be opened. Then you become not a person from Hoosier Gasket Corporation, in my case, who at that point nobody's ever heard of. You become a person for whom the secretary, the member of a staff on the U.S. embassy has called, on whose behalf they have called. They do not realize that they will do that for any company. They think that they would do it only for you because you are a man of weight. Otherwise you would not be able to get the commercial officer in the U.S. embassy to place a call on your behalf. That immediately opens doors, which at least initial doors, which otherwise would not have been open to you, or certainly not as easily. Another experience I had, I was fortunate enough to participate in the U.S. trade mission to Russia on the automotive parts and automotive components in 2012. During that trade mission, we were actually briefly, and I encourage anyone here to go on a trade mission if that opportunity arises, because during that trade mission, we were briefly for a meeting in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Before the meeting, the Department of Commerce was nice enough to ask us whom we would like to have invited to that meeting. And we listed, I did a couple of potential clients. Then those clients in turn received an invitation from the U.S. Embassy, nice gold-gilded invitation, beautiful eagle on top, gorgeous. In fact, it was hand-delivered by a member of the embassy staff with a car with American flag on the bumper and all that. I actually got 2 calls before on a trade mission from them in absolute excitement, saying, "Oh my gosh, we just got an invitation to inviting us to the U.S. Embassy. Did you do this?" And I could with all honesty say, "Well, yes, I did. Are you coming?" They said, "Well, of course we're coming." And then, so the door was opened that way. The ambassador at the time, Michael McPhail, who I believe now is in Stanford University, but at the time he was an ambassador, was also nice enough and smart enough, I think, in retrospect, to come out. We arrived before the official reception. He came out and met every one of us in turn, said hello, remembered who we were, and then in turn, when our Russian colleagues showed up, he re-entered the room, walked around, worked the room in a sense, and said to my potential Russian contact, said, "Oh, have you met Oleg? Oleg and I know each other, have known each other for some time. He didn't relay that some time was 6 minutes earlier, but nevertheless, we know each other for some time. Hoosier Gasket is an excellent American company, which is my pleasure to recommend. At that point, you become not some person from a mid-sized business in the United States. You just became a person who gets the U.S. ambassador to Russia to recommend you. In a Russian businessman's eyes, that increases your stature by a factor of 50, perhaps more. Because he realizes, or she realizes, that they in turn could never get a Russian ambassador to the United States to do the same for them. They don't realize that there's a distance between the government and a public sector, or a private sector, I should say, in Russia that does not exist in the U.S. And we can use that to our advantage in getting the doors opened. So one of the keys to success is actually to use the U.S. government services which they provide free or at nominal cost, because they're taxpayer paid, to open those first doors for you. That's been invaluable to me in my experience, and that creates a immediate credibility for you, which would not otherwise have been created. So that was very helpful. And the other key to that, I think, is patience. Everything, absolutely everything, in Russia and Ukraine, it's true for both countries, takes much longer than anybody tells you that it does. If somebody tells you something will take a month, you can rest assured it'll be 2 months, perhaps 3. It is, if somebody tells you there are 6 steps to get something done, the actual number is 10. They just didn't. They felt bad telling you the truth because they felt 10 would make it more seem more inefficient. So patience is a key to me. The selling cycle is much longer, and you need to just know this going in. Because if you go into this region thinking that you're going to transact a business deal in the same fashion, the same rapidity as you're used to doing in the EU or in the United States, you will be very frustrated and very sorely disappointed, because these things do take a lot longer. And so patience is the key, and using the distance between private and public sector in Russia to your advantage, because they perceive we have the same distance in the U.S., would be another key. That would be it has been the key to success for me, at least.
Very good advice from Oleg.
Thank you.
I'd like to back up and spend a minute to talk about how to prepare to go to Russia and Ukraine. Many times when we have seminars like this, we're assuming that the businesses are ready to go, ready to launch, ready to get on an airplane and go to China or Russia or wherever. I always try to pull back and take a look at what's happening within the company, your company. Have you spent time discussing with management a business plan? Do you have a business plan that makes sense? Does it have expectations that make sense? Does the company have resources to make the endeavor to go to Russia? And resources meaning manpower, monetary, capability. Because going to places like Russia and China and Ukraine, Kazakhstan, it takes a lot of time, and Oleg is exactly right. If you don't have patience, you'll never make it. And there has to be a very, very serious commitment on the part of the company, particularly the board of directors, senior management, that once you begin the effort, you're going to hang with it, you're going to stay with it, and not give up after 2 years, 3 years. Many times, these efforts can take 10 years before you see some development, some positive feedback. And it's incredible how long it can take to get these things done. But unless the company management and the board has a commitment to the program, everybody's wasting time. So that's just my little speech about internal business planning. In terms of actually entering the marketplace, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the Commerce Department was invaluable to me, and through the Gold Key program, and of course there are a variety of programs that you can look at to fit your specific need. And I would encourage you to do that. But before getting on an airplane, I would recommend that you take time to investigate the market, let's say in Russia, to find out, is there a market for your product? Instead of wasting 3 months or 6 months or a year fighting it going into the country, talking to people, spending a lot of time and money, and then finding out 12 months later that there's really no market for your product. It would make a lot of sense to spend time doing extensive market research, talking to people who are in the marketplace, attending conferences, finding people who have done business in Russia, acquiring as much information as you can before you make that decision to go forward. And much of that information would be built into your business plan. Another point, and I'm not sure it was brought up this morning, but it comes up frequently in my contacts when we do business in Russia, and that is many of the American companies, the small-sized, mid-sized companies, in essence lack the capability or the resources to do business through the long haul in Russia, simply because it takes so much time and effort. Look at resources in Europe and Eastern Europe. If your companies have established business relationships through distribution or joint venture agreements, the European companies have a lot of experience working in Eastern Europe and Russia, and they can be a bridge for you to enter the market. And at the very least, they can come to you with information about how to do business in Russia and whether the product makes sense and can enter the market properly. So take a look at your European operations and your connections there, because it may be an advantage for you, at least in a startup position. Again, I would encourage you to look at the Commerce Department's programs. They can certainly be a useful launch for you to introduce you to people in your business in Russia, and you can find out very easily within a 2 or 3 day Gold Key program what your chances are in succeeding in the marketplace. And this is just a personal comment. I've spent years working in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and if I was a small, medium-sized company and I had a choice where I could go to do business in Russia, I would stay away from Moscow as a starter. I think Moscow is very difficult to deal with. It's a unique environment, very, very difficult to maneuver. It's a maze. And if you can find a city outside of Moscow to start your business, I think you may have a better chance to cut through a lot of the bureaucracy and find out if you're going to be successful. So that's just a personal comment. Okay.
Let me add just some additional points to what was said. There are also Russian organizations that are worth contacting whose interest is to attract you as a business. I mentioned earlier in my talk the organization called Opora, which means support in Russia, but it's a association of small and medium-sized businesses in Russia covering all the territories of the entire country. It has a special office that is specifically interested in matching up and attracting international businesses to Russia, either teaming them up or offering them opportunities. There's also other organizations. There are annual events beginning with the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, to more regional events, to events in cities like Yekaterinburg or Tomsk or Nizhny Novgorod and so forth, which are aimed at attracting investors or businesses. I attended several of them, and there were pharmaceutical companies, not the big ones, some of the medium-sized ones from Europe, not many American, but quite a few European businesses go into the Russian market that way. Another area that has not been mentioned so far are the American organizations like the US RBC, the US Russia Business Council, headquartered in Washington, whose aim is to get its members into Russia, work with them, introduce them, connect them to the right officials, and it's probably worth joining them as a member if you're planning to go into business. They have an annual conference, well worth attending. A lot of Russian officials attend. Again, much like Oleg said, if you are introduced in that setting, then the likelihood is that Russian partners will take you seriously because somehow you are seen as being important and having the right patronage in the United States. Another area that I would highly recommend is consulting with Americans who have been very successful investors in Russia. I have one such board member on my board who has done extremely well. Charles Ryan, he has an investment firm that has been investing in Russia for 20 plus years, lives in the United States, would be very interested in giving his perspective as to someone who has done it and done it very successfully. There are others whom I don't know, but there are investors. There are also a cadre of American lawyers who have spent 20 plus years working, international law firms, Baker McKenzie, Decker, I happen to know lawyers at both of them, who would be a very good guide to pitfalls, to changes. There are law firms, they have offices in Moscow with Russian lawyers who really know the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And I would certainly look to them, as well as to the big accounting firms, Ernst & Young, Deloitte. They're all in Russia. They all deal with Russian firms. They deal with American firms, with European firms, and probably are a font of useful information and contacts. And you would need them anyway for legal work, and so you might as well develop a relationship with them before you need them for legal work as well. So that's probably all I would add at this point. I would certainly second what Oleg said about how close you are to power. I mean, in Russia, it's perceived the closer you are to the source of power, the more important you are. And so I'm not always sure the American ambassador is the right guide to it, but whatever the case is, if you can somehow get to levels, it obviously opens doors and makes things much more possible. Thank you.
The last thing I would add is the Exim Bank is a wonderful way also to defray the risk of the possibility of having your orders not paid on time or paid otherwise. They can, I'm not going to spend time on details of it, but they can certainly insure your shipments up to, I believe, 95% of their current value. I think that's a number. And so your risk goes from 100% to 5 or maybe 7, depending on the cost of insurance. So it's another organization that would be very helpful.
One more point, if I can add. One of the things that was very helpful to us in our foundation when we started doing work is that we looked at what Russia calls national priorities. Because if you fit into a national priority, then the level of access and ability to get things done increases greatly. And Russia puts, and they also will then co-fund a lot of things, they will give support, they will encourage. And for example, right now, the buzzword, at least recently, has been reindustrialization. So anything that can be seen as contributing to overall Russian reindustrialization, however that is defined, will obviously gain their attention, and they will roll out the red carpet if they feel that what you are bringing to them fits what they have determined to be their top priorities. Biomedicine is a top priority, IT is a top priority, and these are things that are easily found on websites. You should be looking at Ministry for Economic Development websites, Kremlin websites, as to what their policies are, because then when you are coming to them, you are seen not just as someone there to make money, but you are somehow seen as someone helping them achieve the goals that they have set, and they know that they may need you to achieve them, and therefore you become so much more important to them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Maybe if I'll ask you to follow up a little bit. The last part of the first question is, especially given the Western sanctions imposed, and we heard earlier before lunch representatives of the Department of Commerce commenting on that, and I don't know if you want to echo or offer your own opinions of to what extent that complicates the situation.
I really have no idea, because what we did has nothing to do with sanctions. So
okay.
Yeah, I think that as I believe it was Dushan mentioned, that sanctions are very narrow. They only deal with a very small segment of the economy as a whole. I can tell you that my experience does not deal with that sector of the economy. So unless you are involved in something that is sanctioned, then it should not affect you overall, other than provide perhaps a additional psychological barrier you have to overcome because of the anti-American feeling that was also discussed earlier. But Hoosier Gasket Corporation supplies gaskets and seals for automotive and perhaps construction and agricultural markets. They're not something that's sanctioned. No.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the second question, and again, some of you already started touching upon it, because the second question is on Ukraine, and it's very similar. What are the key success factors for small and medium-sized companies for doing business in Ukraine? And again, there's the last part of it is given the situation, the military conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine.
I really have. I haven't been to Ukraine in 10 years.
Dennis,
I really
you want to
can't
start
say.
on this one? Again, key success factors for doing business in Ukraine for small and medium-sized.
I think Oleg is our expert here. All I can say is that my Russian partners approached me about going to Chernobyl, and we had talked about that for a year or two, and then they advised me to stay away from it and not get involved. So I haven't been to Ukraine.
I have been to Ukraine many times, most recently in November of last year. And one of my largest customer in Eastern Europe is actually in Kharkiv, Ukraine. It's Kharkivsky Traktorny Zavod, or Kharkiv Tractor Plant, XTZ. And they have been, yes, there have been some effect because of the situation with Russia, in part at least, because one of the stockholders is a Russian national. So there has been complications in the way that the orders are processed and the way that the money is allowed to leave to pay for the orders. We've had a couple of delays in payments. Nothing that I would describe as catastrophic or deal breaking, but there were some issues we had to deal and work through. Generally speaking, Ukraine by and large has not been affected. I can second what was said in the morning part of the presentation. Has not been affected by the conflict in its most southeastern corner, unless your customer or the company you're dealing with is actually in Lugansk or that area around where the combat is taking place. There really has not been that much. The one thing that I've noticed, in fact, is there's been an added friendship displayed towards Americans by Ukrainians in view of the fact that they view us, in my opinion correctly, as a key support to them in their struggle against Russia. Ukraine has become more patriotic, visibly so, from my last visit to the one, if you compare to the previous visit. So over the course of the last year, I would say, the Ukrainian flags are in evidence everywhere. Even TV commercials have taken on a distinct patriotic tone to them. There's a cell phone commercial, for example, that I saw that where the tagline was, "You can buy this cell phone plan, unlimited calling throughout Ukraine. Your homeland still independent." That's how it ended. And, so there's it seems much more in evidence, up in your face kind of thing, but in a nice way. There has not been, other than the fact that the Ukrainian hryvnia has been devalued as a result of the conflict and dropped to something like 1/3 of what it was vis-a-vis US dollar, making American goods more important. There has not been a significant impact. Well, that in itself, of course, is also significant, because then whatever you're selling has just tripled in price from the perception of your customer. But if you can get through that, then there has not been anything directly related to the conflict. The side effects have been, of course, the devaluation of the currency, which on the plus side makes your trip a lot cheaper. So your travel to Ukraine becomes significantly less expensive, but your products are not selling as easily. So that's been the main impact. To me, that's what I have experienced. That has been the main impact. The key success factor that I have used to overcome this, in addition to the ones I mentioned earlier with Russia, which are also somewhat true for Ukraine, is that Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian business climate is not as transactional as ours is. In U.S., you and I may do business together, even if we do not know each other very well, because it makes sense. It's mutually profitable, therefore we will do the deal. In Ukraine, that is frequently not the case. They will not do the deal with you until they know who you are. To be perfectly frank, they will not do a deal with you until they drink some vodka with you. That is the reality of the situation. They need to break bread with you, and vodka is certainly the lubricant that is accompanying that. And that is a statement of fact. It's to some degree also true in Russia. They need to know who you are. So building a relationship is very much a big part of doing business. It takes a while. Dennis alluded to it earlier. In Russia, it may take several years. With XTZ, it took me 2 years to get the first order. That was 6 years ago. To this day, every time I'm there, they're still talking about how quickly we got the first order because it only took 2 years. They've never seen it before or since. The selling cycle is a lot longer, but those 2 years were spent on building a relationship. Whenever I go there now, I always, before I leave, stop by the gift shop at the Indy 500 Raceway because that's one of the things they know, and they appreciate that you bring them some souvenir which is not readily available in Ukraine. They'll be the only one with the new, lapel pin from the 100th running of the Indy 500. It's an inexpensive little gift, but they appreciate it a great deal because it's unique. It's uniquely American. In return, they will do the same thing for you. I was mentioning to someone earlier that one of the visits I was in, when I was in XTZ, before I left, the CEO asked me to stop by his office and presented me with a soccer ball autographed by every member of the Kharkiv medalist soccer team. He knows that my son is a soccer player. That ball is still on my son's shelf. That was like several years ago, but because he said, this is for your son, we know he plays soccer, and this will be, I assure you, he'll be the only kid in Indiana who will have a soccer ball autographed by the entire medalist team. And they do these things for you because we are now not just colleagues, we have a personal relationship, we're friends as far as our distances will allow. And while it is difficult to build that bridge, and it is a bit difficult to get that first order, may take several years, in fact probably will, once you do establish that relationship and once you have these orders flowing, it is also very difficult for somebody else to displace you. Once you are in, you're in essentially for life to some degree. I have colleagues there to whom I speak on a regular basis, and when the business was in difficulty because of the currency devaluation, or when the payment is late, they call me. They call me home and say, listen, we will be late with this payment. Here is why. Please don't panic. We apologize. But this is what's going on, and this is why. And so we are aware of it. We know it's not them trying to avoid us, and this is because of that relationship. That relationship is much more important than it would be in the U.S. business. The personal interaction is very significant, and that is what has helped us overcome whatever impact, although, as I mentioned before, has been mostly indirect, the conflict in Ukraine has caused. So, do I still do business with them? I'm sure they will be doing business together for years to come because I just am. I'm confident in our relationship to that degree. So.
Let me just add one.
Certainly.
On timing and relationships. For us to be able to sell our technology in Russia, we had to be certified, receive formal certification by Rosatom, which is the state nuclear agency. It took us 3 full years to get that done. And now we're the only foreign technology that's been certified by Rosatom. So that opens the door, but it was painful. That whole process was very painful and expensive. So there are hurdles that some of us have to jump over in order to reach our goal. And then I would like to second the comments about relationships. Over the years, I've established very close relationships with the senior scientists in the nuclear field and nuclear sector in Russia. And we have written probably 10 white papers that have been presented all over the world on what we have done in Russia in the weapons sector. That has opened the doors for me because we have it documented, all of our experiments, everything we've done is documented and published on a global basis. So that also helps me longer term in the marketplace.
Okay. Mark, anything else to add? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We will go to the next question. The next question, again, applies both to Russia and Ukraine. So for a new company going into either Russia or Ukraine, medium-sized or small company, how can they learn more about how consumers make decisions in those countries so that they can meet those needs better?
I can start if that's all right. Basically, I would say there are three main sources. One is the U.S. Embassy to start with. They can start with putting you in the right places, connecting you. Then from that, you expand to the American Chamber of Commerce and other businesses that already are doing business in Russia. Another source I think is that is overlooked frequently is the expatriate community. A lot of people in this room right now were born, although they live in the United States now, were born in either the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. So they have personal experience or family experience, let's say, someone like myself who grew up in upstate New York but has first generation American with Russian or Ukrainian roots, where you can ask ask the expatriate communities and find out how those decisions are made. I know that they're made differently in Eastern Europe than they are in the United States. A lot of it is perception and how the products are perceived. In the case of, in my experience, we're not dealing with consumer products, we're dealing with business products, but American products still have a cachet in the sense that they're perceived as being superior by a typical person on the street, by a typical business person in Russia and Ukraine. The thing is, I have to say that in most cases, their perception is absolutely correct. When our first shipment of our gaskets arrived, I've been told this, I wasn't there when it arrived, but the first shipment of our gaskets, for example, arrived in Kharkov tractor plant. I was told after the fact that the engineers from neighboring departments come over to look at the gaskets, look at the Amerikansky gaskets, as they sell them, because they looked like a museum piece to them. There was no fibers hanging off, the edges were all clean cut, etc. They were so used to an inferior product received from a local supplier that in that particular case, we were happy to help to reinforce the perception of our superior quality. So there is that aspect of it. And that is another key to success, I would think, that you need to make sure that first of all, that the perception is reinforced, and then that it is developed going further. I'm not sure if you...
Just a couple of things. I remember when we started looking at some markets in Eastern Europe, first place I went was Bloomington to talk to professors at the business school and the library. I mean, there are a lot of resources in your backyard that you can start the process to research your product, whether or not it's going to be applicable in the marketplace. So that's all I want to say on that.
Oleg said expats. I would add expats living in Russia who are American or European also provide a very, I think, important source. People in the banking sector, law sector, who have been living or are living in Russia, but obviously come from the West and could sort of bridge that gap and tell you what would work, what wouldn't. I would again reiterate some of the regional meetings that are open to anyone. I attended and spoke at a meeting in St. Petersburg a few years ago on innovation in business. And there were at least 4 or 5 people representing American companies looking for a niche in the Russian market, and they had come to this conference in hopes of both finding out for themselves, making connections, making the right introductions, and it seemed to go very well. So I mean, that's another source. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which is the place, is probably unnecessarily expensive and may not be the right place for a medium-sized business, but it's a very, very good place to be seen, to make the right connections, to sit at the right table, maybe for a more mature business, but it certainly is important. And there's always AmCham in Moscow, there's U.S.-Russia Business Council. There are lots of opportunities, I think, to make those connections.
And of course, maybe to add people like our distinguished panelists, so we have people who are successful, who are doing business in those countries. I'm sure they will be able and will be happy to share their experiences and help you. And of course, I like the comments about the expats and the business school professors, especially if a business school professor is an expat. Okay. Now we are moving to the next question. The next question is about, again, problems with corruption in both countries, and how can American companies still operate responsibly given the issues with corruption?
The most difficult question, one of them. Hopefully you're aware of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which affects all of us doing business in countries that are dominated by government agencies, and how can we approach those markets and penetrate and be successful without getting ourselves in trouble. In my case, with our product, everyone we work with is government. It's military, the nuclear labs. So if I'm asked to sell product directly to them, I'm probably going to find myself in trouble. And Russia was not the first market where I've encountered this issue before, because I've worked 38 years in China. My recommendation is, and this is what I've done over the years, find a good distributor that's going to be your sales point and work only with that distributor. That distributor, if it's the right distributor and that distributor knows the marketplace, knows the primary customers, as in our case with Radon, they're the premier company in Russia for waste treatment, they will know how to conduct the business. All I'm going to do is provide technical services to customers and sell the product to the distributor. What happens beyond that, I don't know, and I don't want to know. But that's the only way that we are able to function in that marketplace. So that's a fairly blunt statement, but that's real world for me.
I haven't fortunately had any unpleasant experiences when it came to corruption, except is that Russians sort of have a hard time, at least in the nonprofit sector, of open competition. They always sort of assume that, it's my turn this time, it's that organization's, and to sort of introduce the whole notion that, several organizations compete, we set up a panel, we try to make it as transparent as possible, was difficult. I think people appreciated it. I think after a while they accepted the fact that we were open about it, but I think there was some problem getting over that issue. There's also, when people ask me about corruption in Russia, I say, well, I never experienced anywhere I had to pay anyone off, but certain services are opaque. So if you want to get a I had a work visa. To get a work visa, I needed a health certificate. To get a health certificate, I presumably could go to several Russian medical facilities and spend several days doing it. Or the law firm that we worked with said, don't worry, for a fee, we'll take care of all of your medical. And it's not really, you're not paying any, but you just to expedite things, there are all these services that are provided. And in a sense, most foreign organizations, most foreigners end up having to use them because otherwise you'll never get anything done. I can tell you a funny story. We had a dog that we were transporting, we had brought from the United States to Russia, and then from Russia we were taking it to Britain UK when we were moving. And the UK has very, very strict, forms that have to be filled out. Where was the dog? Did it have the right shots? Did it this? And I got very nervous, and I told the moving company in Moscow, I said, where am I going to get this done, and so forth. I said, don't worry, it's part of your package, we're moving it. So I get the papers, and it's all lies. Was the dog ever with other dogs? No, says the veterinary. I had all the right stamps, and it was just part of doing business. To them, it was totally fictitious piece of paper that didn't correspond to anything, but that's the only way you can get things done, and otherwise you'd never get the dog out of Russia, you'd never get the dog into the UK. So that's a way in which that is where I see the corruption in Russia. It's, at least from my angle, it's not big stuff. It's this endless little forms and so forth, that there's always a fee to making it happen.
Also, I've not dealt with government directly because insofar as our customers have always been private organizations, again, government in Russia is omnipresent, so in some connection, that's why I said I didn't deal with them directly. And obviously very aware of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I've never been in a situation where I was asked to pay a bribe or a fee. However, I've been in situations where that was hinted at. Russians are very good at dropping hints. If you pick up the hint, they will continue. If you do not, they're usually polite enough to walk away. That has been my experience largely with that. I can tell you that I mentioned earlier one of my earliest experiences dealing with that region of the world was with baby food equipment in Uzbekistan. I was not directly involved with this, but my understanding is Uzbekistan, for those of you who do not know, is one of only 2 double landlocked countries on Earth. Not only is it landlocked, every country it borders is also landlocked, which makes shipping there interesting, since the ships do not dock in Uzbekistan. They dock typically in Baku or somewhere else in the Black Sea. Equipment gets unloaded, loaded on a train, and then goes to Uzbekistan. When the train arrives, this is going back into the late 90s, so things may have changed. I hope they have. But when the train arrived at the Uzbeki border, a smiling uniformed guard boards the train. He then proceeds to offer you a sheet. It's a laminated sheet in 4 languages, including English, very convenient, which shows a photograph of the guard's shoulder boards indicating the rank of the guard and a corresponding fee that he expects for passing the train through in 4 different currencies. They accept euros, US dollars, British pounds, and some other currency, as I understand it. Now, this is not actually, I was told later by an attorney, and this was this was a long time ago, that this is not actually bribery because it's not illegal. Apparently at the time, my understanding is secondhand, the border guards did not get paid at all. This is how they were expected by the Uzbeki government to receive their money. So this was completely open. So therefore, there was no corruption. They weren't hiding anything. It was just a fee. And if you chose not to pay the fee, the guard still smiled. Your train simply went on a siding where it sat and underwent for the next 2 or 3 days actual detailed inspection. Then they would sign off and you would go on. Or they would stamp the documents, collect the fee, and move on, and you'd go on right away. To your point earlier, it was more of a facilitation device. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not an attorney, and I'm not sure of exactly the legal implications of that particular transaction. I can tell you that it did take place at the time, and at the time it was not perceived as either illegal or hidden by the Uzbeki government. That is what the Uzbeki government expected their border guards to do at that time. So there you have it. It's kind of a gray area. My personal favorite example many years ago. In Russia and Ukraine, we've never had to do that, but again, would it be perceived in a private company setting, the fact that I bring a gift when I arrive to my colleague of a, $70 souvenir from the Indianapolis racing gift shop, Indianapolis Raceway gift shop? Or is this just saying hello to a friend and giving him haven't seen you for a while, here's a gift for you? And similarly, would it be perceived as somehow improper to that soccer ball that my son's? I believe that simply that's an exchange of gifts between friends. So,
if I could just add just a point that when the word corruption comes up in the United States and in Europe, we have one conception of it. I mean, there's a historical conception in the Anglo-American world that's evolved as to what corruption is. It's not the case in Russia. And what Oleg just described in old Russia was called kормlение. This is how officials in, let's say, medieval Russia, Tsarist Russia, had no salaries. They had to go and live off of whatever they could get from the population. That was a totally normally accepted practice of civil service in Russia. Secondly, to have a Western conception of corruption, you have to have a Western conception of private property. That also doesn't exist in Russia. So the Panama Papers this week are not causing much of a sensation at all in Russia, because it is absolutely expected that if you're at a certain level in the government, commensurate to that, you will take what is allowed to you at that level. There's a great line in Gogol's play Inspector General where one character turns to the other and says, you are taking bribes not according to your rank. So the crime was not taking bribes, the crime was taking it not according to the rank at which you are allowed to take bribes. It's a very different conception. So when you talk to Russians, it doesn't cause the same concerns that all the people in the Anglo-American world, because we have a very clear notion of what is private property, what belongs to the state, how you adjudicate between them, how you pay. In Russian, I mean, let's face it, not only is the state in control, but the state runs most of the major economy, one way or another. It could be hidden, it could be under some guise, but basically they own the country. And as I said earlier, a lot of Russians consider private property as merely a property allowed to you to be used for a period of time. And so, you know, corruption is just perceived very differently. And I think that when Russians and Americans talk about it, they're sometimes talking past each other.
I have a quick story. Just a quick story to share with you. We had one prospective customer come to us. He had a very serious problem. He said that the government had allocated $1 million to his company to clean up this problem, and he liked our technology, and he said, but for us to do this, you'll have to give me the 30% off the top. So, and within the industry that I work, that's generally speaking the average kickback. So it exists. We all have to deal with it, I think, in certain ways. I know of an American fast food company that spent years setting up stores in Russia. They faced all sorts of different types of problems. The one I explained to you about us was just a very simple, here we have a budget and I want 30% back. In other cases, the corruption is different. The form of corruption can be different. And it's just important to be sensitive about it, be alert. And I want to emphasize the importance of finding a good, solid, local partner in Russia, because we can't do business ourselves. We have to find people that understand American ways of doing business and understand our products, and that know how to navigate the marketplace in Russia. And doing due diligence, research on those partners is absolutely critical, essential. Going through a law firm, that can pay off. Have them do an investigation of a prospective partner to make sure that that partner is clean. But it's very important to have a local partner who can help you in that marketplace.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just to follow up, again, given that I teach international marketing, that's what I always tell my students. Then in any foreign country, pretty much, it's one of your most important decisions is decide who to partner with. And finding a good local partner is very, very important, in particular in countries like Russia and Ukraine. And again, coming back specifically to the corruption problem, as our panelists were indicating earlier, you need to be very careful. So first of all, you don't want to break any American laws, right? So we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And of course, then there was the Omnibus Trade Reconciliation Act later, which made facilitating payments, like I believe Dennis was talking about, it's not a crime. So you could do that. But again, keep in mind that you would actually go to jail if you're caught giving bribes. So you need to be very careful. And so, of course, again, sometimes, again, it could be a gray area. And so then you need to make a decision. But sometimes it's obviously a bribe, it's obviously corruption. But I would definitely recommend staying away from that and just not doing that.
And the thing is, if you give somebody a bribe, they'll always be back for more.
Exactly.
That's why have a lot of patience, as I mentioned earlier. It'll take longer, but once you get there, at least you don't have to worry about any knocks on the door.
Exactly. And again, it's more difficult for small companies and medium-sized companies compared to the big companies. So the bigger companies, sometimes they could they could appeal to higher authorities. And so it's like, again, Russians, they try to maintain appearance of orderly things. So for example, there was a case with IKEA. And IKEA is, of course, a huge Swedish company. And so there was a problem that there was a local authorities in Moscow. They were trying to facilitate some bribes for opening up. They had a grand opening of their store scheduled. And so they were not granting that permission. And then the CEO of IKEA, he went straight to Putin. He appealed to Putin. And so Putin apparently called the local authorities in Moscow, and everything was done within hours. So, but if you're small, or again, to maintain the appearance, okay, yeah, what do you think? We don't have any problems with corruption. But for small and medium-sized companies, it's much more difficult, much more challenging. Okay, well, I think we're moving to the next question. And again, it's of a more general nature. So despite the appeal to foreign businesses, it has been said that Russia is a challenging market to access due to a number of factors, due to geography, language barriers, heavy bureaucracy, shortage of modern workforce skills, and lack of available financing. So what can businesses new to Russia do to overcome these obstacles? And you have touched upon a lot of them already, but again, anything that you may want to add to this.
My personal experience has been that, without question, the fact that I can speak Russian has been incredibly helpful. Everything that I would have done, even if I would have done it with the help of a translator, which would have obviously been necessitated if I did not speak Russian myself, would have taken orders of magnitude longer to achieve if you cannot do it firsthand. Secondly, it is also, so the language is a wonderful advantage to you to have, especially since we as Americans aren't expected to speak anything else but English. We have well earned a reputation for being the only monolingual society, I don't even know if that's a word, monolingual society in the world. There's a joke that everybody tells me that if you speak 3 languages in Europe, you're trilingual. If you speak 2, you're bilingual. If you speak only English, you're an American tourist. And that's been told to me because people do not expect Americans to speak a foreign language, and therefore are more impressed when you do. If you do, they're impressed with it. So that's a huge time saver and a huge advantage. If you do not, obviously, that's not something that can come by easily. I was fortunate because of a combination of my heritage and education early in life that I do speak Russian, as are a lot of people in this room that speak Russian very well. But by and large, that's rare. So if that's the case, you need to make sure that you have a very reliable translator, not just reliable in a sense of skill, but a reliable that he or she is translating what it is you are saying. Because in essence, you have no control over you may communicate it exactly right in English, but you have absolutely no control of what your conversationalist is hearing through the translator. So you need to make absolutely sure. This is one person who is often overlooked and can be key to securing or scuttling an agreement based either on their competence or lack thereof, and secondly, based on the fact of what if they could be very competent, but just there to undermine what it is you're trying to do. So that's very important.
If I can just pick up on that and say that speaking Russian obviously is very important, not only for communicating, but I think for reading the other person's intentions. Because you're working with a translator, you are not being able to absorb what your interlocutor is saying, implying, all the things that are suggested but not set up, and how accurately the translator is translating what that person is saying. So it's a two-way thing. I would say I've seen very successful people in Russia, though, who don't speak a word of Russian. But, and this is the big but, they have spent time reading Russian literature, reading Russian history, following cultural events, knowing Russian artists, understanding, and that has made a tremendous difference. Even though they don't speak the language, the fact that they made an effort to acquaint themselves with the basic attributes of Russian culture, and I'm sure the same thing would be true for Ukraine, it would be true for any number of countries. Again, Americans are not only not expected to know a foreign language, they're not expected to know anything. And so when you are able to speak knowledgeably about history or about culture or about literature, the whole perception of you is changed dramatically.
I'll share one personal anecdote because before passing it on to Dennis. The first time I came to Kharkiv, I arrived. I was, took a car from the hotel to the hotel, and it just so happened that particular time there was a statue of the hotel I stayed in had a statue of Shevchenko in front of it. Now, for those who do not know, it's a very famous Ukrainian poet.
That's something you should know.
Yeah,
You
something you
should
should
not
know.
go to Ukraine if you don't know who Shevchenko is. Period.
And the funny thing that resulted from this, I have shared this anecdote thereafter with all of my Ukrainian colleagues, and they love it. I called home to let my family know that I arrived safely. And so I'm talking to my wife. My oldest son picks up the phone also. As I mentioned earlier, he's a soccer player and significantly involved in soccer. And so he said, have you seen anything yet? I said, no, I've just arrived, but there is a statue of Shevchenko in front of this hotel. And so he asked me, is he wearing the Ukrainian national team jersey or the Chelsea jersey on the statue? Because there's also a soccer player by the same first name. The Ukrainians, it's a true story. When I tell them, they love it. We've had water come out of the guy's, of a CEO's nose. He started laughing so hard, which serves as an icebreaker. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. The fact that my son, he now knows who Shevchenko is, but at the time he did not, and that's an example of that.
Language in Russia is an issue. And even though I studied in the Soviet Union, I certainly was not in any position to speak Russian. So it's very important to have a translator. But go back to what I said earlier. When you're considering the Russian market and you do a business plan, all of this has to be factored in, because good interpreters, translators are not cheap. And if you're spending a lot of time in Russia, it's going to cost money. So that needs to be considered. And the time, just the time it takes for translation. You're thinking about going to Moscow for 2 to 3 days to get your business done. You may not get it done in that period of time simply because it's going to take at least half more time to get it done through translation, and maybe more. So those things are very important in your planning process. And then to go back to what I said a few minutes ago about partner, this is another reason to have a very good partner in Russia that has English capability, because you probably won't have it in-house yourself. If your partner has English capability, it's certainly going to help you along in the process.
And generally speaking, in Eastern Europe as a whole, one last comment on the topic, the fact that you take the time to go is very much appreciated. As I said, it's not a transactional economy. They do appreciate that you made your way all the way across the ocean and came to visit them. This is not Russia, but an example. I was in Hungary on a business trip and stopped by an Allison transmission for those, an automotive company plant, who is our customer. We didn't have an issue. We didn't have a problem. There was, I just happened to be in Hungary, and I figured since I'm already there, I will stop by the small town of St. Gotthard and visit Allison. I visited Allison. I was told there, you are the first supplier who's come here without being summoned because of an issue. We're so happy you're here. This was great. I was, gratified that was the case. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in the Indiana Automotive Council meeting. I happen to be sitting next to a VP of Allison. We exchange business cards. He looks at my cards. Now, okay, granted, with Oleg Ostomelsky, it's not like Bob Smith. The name is significantly unusual. But he looks at my name, looks at me, goes, you're the guy who was just at our plant in Hungary, aren't you? I said, yes, I was. I heard about that. That's wonderful. How is that plant? I haven't been there myself yet. So the fact that you take the effort to go is noted throughout Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine included. And an example is Hungary, but it's true in that whole region.
Just to follow up, communications are very important. And so Russia, Ukraine, a number of other Eastern European countries, they're what we refer to as high context cultures. And so again, it's a continuum. Some cultures are low context. And so again, the US is closer to the low context, not at the extreme. But Russia, a lot of Eastern European countries are the high context cultures where a lot is being transmitted implicitly. And so from that perspective, knowing the language is very important, or at the very least having a very good translator who you can rely on and who you can trust also becomes very, very important. Okay, and we're moving to the next question. Richard Branson, the founder of the Virgin Group, has stated that often when times are difficult, that's when people should invest. when he was asked about what he thinks stops foreign investors from investing in Ukraine. What are your thoughts of his opinion, and what do you think stops foreign investors from investing in Ukraine?
Well, quick answer to what keeps people from investing in Ukraine is Russia. No, in all seriousness, probably it's a very wise thing. I would say, I mean, I haven't been to Ukraine in a couple of years, but from everything I can gather, it is welcoming the West, it's welcoming the U.S., and I think one should ride that wave. Because I've seen in the case of Russia where the U.S. was very much welcome in the 90s, and for a while we were sort of, and then it came to a halt. Hopefully it won't happen that way in Ukraine, but it's a wonderful time in which to make relationships, to develop relationships, to even if things will take time to develop, this is the time to grab the opportunity.
Well, absolutely, I couldn't agree with Mark more, especially going back to the question, to the earlier comment that everyone here made about how long it takes to establish a relationship. This is a time when you establish a relationship. This is the time you put in to, okay, fine, you won't get an order for a while, but this is when you build the relationship with your colleague there. I've also relayed a brief anecdote about Ukraine. I was the very first time, this is going back a long time ago, now that I think about it, it was more like 8 years ago, I think, that the very first time I ever went to Ukraine, and not knowing very much of what the legal requirements were, I actually called the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. to ask what I needed and everything else. And it was interesting how the question was answered, to show you how welcoming Ukraine is. As I was done asking my questions, the last question asked said, "Oh, by the way, I don't believe I need a visa to go to Ukraine, but can you confirm that I actually don't need one? Because I do know that I need one for Russia." And the response I got was extremely funny and also telling at the same time. The person answered, "No, sir, you do not need a visa to come to Ukraine. We are a civilized country." It was exactly in that tone of voice. So they are very welcoming of American visitors. And it's illustrated in small things like this: the fact that they don't need a visa. You don't need a visa to go to Ukraine. I can go to Ukraine as easily as I could go to London. Well, the flight is a little longer, but other than that. Whereas for Russia, I need to prepare and send them an application and all that rigmarole, which we put up with. But it's not as easy. So yes, they are welcoming, and I would say that now is the time to build the relationships and use the fact that you don't need a visa.
Okay, so we're going to our last question then. Well, Indiana currently exports machinery, chemicals, electrical equipment, and transportation equipment to Russia. What are the future growth areas in Russia and the Ukraine that small to medium-sized companies can explore to further their business opportunities there?
Mark, would you like to start with that? With us, it's I would say clearly that the things that Russia needs right now. And I believe some use the term reindustrialization to explain that. To put it very bluntly and not very favorably, in many ways, if you want to strip Russia down to its essentials, economically speaking, it's a gas station with a flag planted on top. Right now, it is a country whose economy exists exclusively on their materials they can get from the earth. They are very fortunate. Their earth is very rich in those materials. They have a lot of gas, a lot of oil, various other metals, diamonds, all those kinds of things. However, as a consequence of that, their economy fluctuates up and down based on the world price of those commodities, but it's a commodity producer. So long term, I think that immediately what they need is a machinery to get those things out of the ground. So all those things are growth industries regardless of whatever the Russian military may be doing in Syria, in Crimea, or elsewhere. But they're going to need to get the oil out of the ground, the gas out of the ground, dig up the diamonds out of Siberian permafrost, etc. So they need all that associated excavation and transportation equipment to do that. Long term, I am hopeful that they will, in fact, industrialize as they claim that's their national priority. And the long term, they're going to need equipment to equip the factories of the region. I have been through a few factories in Russia that have not been joint ventured with Western companies, and in Ukraine as well. And I can tell you that there's equipment there that's state-of-the-art circa 1955. I've actually seen presses that are actually still have a stamp on them that they were made in someplace in Michigan, I forgot the town, in 1955, and it's still in operation. It's been resold 1,000 times on the secondary market, and it's still in operation in a factory in this case, in Nizhny Novgorod. Now, is it true everywhere? No, but there's enough of it left around to where this modern, upgraded equipment will be required if, in fact, reindustrialization is coming. In the meantime, all the equipment that's needed to get the raw materials that they are rich in out of the ground.
I'm going to repeat myself and go back to the gold key, because I think in this particular market, the help through the Commerce Department can be extraordinarily helpful to you to find out if, in fact, you have the ability to sell your products in the marketplace. And you can do it quickly. I mean, within a week's trip, you're going to know pretty much what the market looks like, whether or not your product has a chance to penetrate. So I would encourage all of you to look seriously at utilizing the Commerce Department services.
I will second that, because I've been in 5 gold keys, and I wouldn't have gone to numbers 2 through 5 if the first one didn't go well, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. So they're exceptional programs, and they are $700, $750, I believe, is a nominal fee, and they introduce you to a number of potential suppliers or customers or distributors, whatever it is you're looking for. And most of those introductions do not work out. However, you learn a lot from them, and the few that do become your customers. XTZ we met through a gold key, Kharkov Tractor Plant. Gaz, to whom we are a Tier 2 supplier, not a Tier 1, but a Tier 2, but we still got introduced and went through the process of being certified as a Tier 2 supplier, approved as a Tier 2 supplier. We met through a gold key. So they're very effective.
Okay, we're done with the questions part, so with the prepared questions. So now we'll open it to the public. So what questions do you have for the panelists? Not all at the same time, please.
What groups are available locally that would tie into other businesses that work or that are at least more amenable to, in particular, Ukraine? Our company I work for is U.S. based, but originally from Ukraine. The owners are originally from Ukraine, and we have Ukraine R&D in terms of technical development. So just trying to, part of that is to find places where you would see common ground with other companies that have either had experience working with Ukraine or are more open to those kinds of experiences.
I would, 3 things. First, I would say that there is the India, has already been mentioned, I think Dushan's, the gentleman sitting right next to you at the same table, mentioned the Indiana District Export Council. Okay. That would be one such body.
Yeah, I missed the morning session. So,
oh,
yeah,
I'm sorry. One such body would be the Indiana District Export Council. Both Dennis and myself actually sit on that council, as does Dr. Malachi, who's sitting at the table across the path from you there. And so there's several other members. And so we, as a group, have a lot of knowledge about dealing with, perhaps we may not have the answer you're looking for, but we can put you in touch with someone who would. So that would be an example. There is a, you can call the, if you're looking for a company that deals with Ukraine, you can call the U.S. Department of Commerce Export Assistance Center in Carmel, Indiana. They're located in Carmel, but do you remember the number off the top of your head, Dushan? Could you give that gentleman the number? I know it's your old office, but you can give him the number.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, it's on that card. So, and they can also put you in touch. Those are some of the starting points. There are others at state level, like depending on what business you're in. For example, if you're an automotive business, there's the Indiana Automotive Council. There is the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, things of that nature. So,
because I know in Chicago, obviously with the bigger Ukrainian population there, there's certain events that are geared towards Ukrainian businesses in Chicago, those kinds of things. I don't know if we have anything similar to that in Indianapolis, or it's just not quite as big a market for that.
Chicago also has the sister city relationship with got a sister
Yeah. I lived in Chicago for a while. It's the only place where I was never asked how to spell my last name. If people like, oh, Gostomelsky, sure. But yeah, there's a lot of Ukrainians in Chicago. I'm not aware of any activities or like, is there a Ukrainian Indiana Friendship Society or anything like that? I'm just making that up because I don't know if there is. Maybe there is one, and it's called something like the Friendship Society or something like that. I don't know. But you can call the Ukrainian consulate in Chicago. They probably put you in touch with some, because they're the nearest one. Oh, there you go.
Sorry?
In D.C., the U.S. Ukraine Business Council.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anybody else?
Sure.
Danica?
It's a comment and question going back to the corruption issue, and you're mentioning that there's the sort of Western. I would actually put the Europeans separate from the Anglo-American because I think their concept of corruption and whatnot is a little bit different. Was interested in your story, particularly about Uzbekistan. We've seen that they're getting smarter about some things in the sense that instead of it being like a back channel thing, they will actually now, for customs, want to specifically charge certain fees. And what we found is that it's not FCPA because they are charging everybody the fee.
Right.
And it's transparent, and it's going, in this case, I mean, you're paying it to the government. And because they're not in like the World Trade Organization or something like that, we can't do anything about it. But I wondered, just in general, if you could elaborate on any other sort of systemic things, specific like that, that you've had in doing business in the region. As Mark mentioned, in the case of Russia, right now we're not necessarily welcomed by the Russian government, but in general, we still are working through multilateral fora and other things to try to resolve some of these business environment issues. So are there any other specific examples like that where you've seen an institutionalized barrier, I would say? Not necessarily corruption, but I mean, I'm sure there's lots of examples, but what are some of the big red flags? Because we also providing counseling to people looking at, so your advice is actually very good to hear.
My experience with that has been not so much. I mean, I mentioned this to Mark earlier. I'm almost Russians in my experience, people I've dealt with, are very practical people. I think many of them, and I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not trying to make it sound bad, but some of them almost have a dual personality. They're a different person in private than they are in public. They will say all the right things that need to be said in a public setting. That's not how they really feel. They wear a perpetual permanent mask. And those of them who grew up during the Soviet Union are very good at it. They are skilled at pretending to be person A, and then in private they're person B. So, if you want to know what in my experience, if you want to know what your Russian colleague really thinks, over dinner or in a private setting, once you get to know them and you've established that relationship, you are much, much more likely to find out what their opinion is than in any kind of public venue. They're very good in wearing that mask and hiding their minds. That's been my experience. I don't think that they are duplicitous by choice. I think that's just their survival mechanism of having to live in the country where when they were young kids, that was expected, and now it's sort of kind of becoming expected again because there's an anti-American feeling, but yet they realize they still need to do business with us. So we'll pay lip service to the West is bad, we don't want to deal with them, we're not going to do anything with them. But then in reality, I still need these products to make these widgets or whatever we're making it. So
yeah, I would second that. I think that the political culture in the Soviet Union, as was the case and is the case in China, it's the same suppression of public speaking. People do not want to express their real thoughts in public for fear of reprisal. And when you do get to know them privately, as Oleg said, it's absolutely correct. If you're having a one-on-one discussion with them and there's no one else around, you'll find out what they're really thinking. So there are two ways to see these people and understand them. But it takes some time to do that.
Just to follow up on that, yes, somebody who has grown up in the Soviet Union, that I think that is absolutely true. So you had to say certain things in public, but again, in private, people were talking about very differently, expressing very different opinions. We had this saying, well, it's like a kitchen conversation. So because sometimes, even in private, you have like a big party, you cannot say things to the whole group. But okay, let's go to the kitchen and let's talk more openly. With a glass of vodka, of course.
Yeah, it's, I wouldn't say that vodka fuels business in Russia, but it certainly lubricates it. One of the most interesting meetings I had was when I was taught how to drink vodka the proper way. With a piece of bread and some butter on it, and others zakuski, and how you do it, and it was sala. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's more Ukrainian, but yes. And it was a bonding experience. I still to this day don't know how many shots we had, but it was a lot. And we were at the restaurant that was on the first floor of the hotel, so no drinking and driving was involved, just drinking and walking. So I knew which button to push. I had to just count them up.
Have you tried the hot pepper vodka? I hear that's big there too. It's a sign you get the sinuses cleaned out at the same time.
It makes the world's best Bloody Mary. I will say that. So, but the culture is that way. So they drop hints very well. If you speak the language, you can understand the hints.
I just want to take the opportunity. I'm looking at my watch because I have to go and catch a plane back to Washington, but I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the day and how enlightening it was, and so I wish you all very, very good luck.
Mark, thank you. Nice meeting you.
Even with Mark leaving, we do still have time if any of you have any further questions or just want to mingle.
Test. I have more or less a comment with respect to the kind of industries that can be expected to be. I can't say whether to be growing much, but they will be certainly buoyant over the next, let's say, 2 decades, especially in Russia. It's already been mentioned, the energy industry. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the gas industry. Russia has some trillions of cubic feet of gas reserves, the largest gas reserves in the world. But it hasn't really taken steps to invest in and open up a new gas field since 72 or 73. It's really creaking along on the industrial investment of the past. This is the reason why the United States, with a small fraction of the gas reserves of Russia, is today outproducing them. And the reason why the world gas price has fallen is that American production has picked up. Now, we've got a lot of gas, but they've got some multiple of what we have. They just can't get at it. Even with a full court press investing today, it would take them 5 or 6 years, maybe a little longer, to be able to tap into it all. They're aware of this, and so I fully expect that in that particular industry, there's going to be opportunities to be able to sell them equipment. They won't be able to make enough of it in the modern stuff to be able to service their own industry in the long haul. So if this is something that you or friends of yours are manufacturing, what you're known for, this is going to be an area, I think, of tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. We're not in that business, but we provide components to that business. So yes, gas, oil, anything that needs to be dug out of the ground, they can they have it, but they're getting to it, but it's not as efficient or as well developed as it should be. So, yeah, absolutely, that's true.
Okay. Anybody else? Any questions, comments?
I was just wondering, and I guess this is a general question for anyone that might be able to tell. We talk about Russia oftentimes as being a resource-rich economy and very dependent on oil. But I was wondering, I've been seeing in the news, estimates anywhere from, 50% of the economy being dependent on oil, or more than half, and as little as like 15-16%. So what are your thoughts? Anyone in the room have like a more precise number? Because lately what we've been hearing that, in the last 10-15 years that Russia has diversified somewhat its economy and is actually producing more stuff. But I don't know,
About half of the state budget revenues are derived from oil and gas. In terms of the economy, it's a far smaller percentage. But it's clearly a priority for the state sector in order to invest in the energy industry today. So the reason why they're seeking that well, they have signed that wonderful long-term deal with China, which some of us were chatting about during the lunch break, is it's an opportunity for them in the short run, but in the long run, it's really a loser. Extractive industries are low value added. It's already been pointed out. Oleg mentioned they're subject to world commodity prices and fluctuations. It's not something that they have any control over. There's no clear competitive advantage there, And if you look at the profile of the typical Western country, the OECD members, let's say, the kinds of industries for which they are known are especially the growth industries, high value added, high engineering content, low labor content, kinds of industry, the kind of thing that can produce large margins over the long run, and that's just for Russia not to diversify, I think, is a long-term losing proposition.
Right, and it has diversified to a certain extent, but it's a very small extent, so it definitely needs to do much, much more, and especially in terms of exports. So most of the exports revenue come from sale of oil and gas, and that's the big problem for Russia.
Mark mentioned earlier that before he left that they can make an effort to being government being omnipresent. One of the advantages of a command economy in this case, not that I'm advocating command economy, is that once they determine what the national priority is, they can turn a lot of resources towards that and make it the national priority. They've certainly done it very famously in one obvious arena is the world of sports. When back in the Soviet days they decided that this particular thing is important, boy, they're producing world champions in 10 years. And they can do the same thing, and China is doing that now. I mean, China is the command economy. They're trying to get their, as I understand it, basketball program off the ground. And we all have heard of Yao Ming, but he's the first of many to follow, which were just being command economy style. I'm not comparing people to resources, but in a sense, that's exactly what they do.
And the space industry was also the same
Absolutely.
thing. They target a certain technology and they go with it.
Yeah. So if Vladimir Putin decides to make reindustrialization a priority and places a few phone calls, or even if he doesn't place a few phone calls, just says reindustrialization is a priority, I bet you it'll be a priority very quickly for everybody involved.
And want to thank each of you for your time and, of course, all the energy you put into
Thank you very
preparing.
much.
So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky.
Big round of applause. You guys did great.
Thank you.